when reflecting on step one in the first three steps, but mainly step one, we recognize powerlessness piece of drug addicts and alcoholics over these substances. The powerlessness, the physical powerlessness, this allergy, this phenomenon of craving is drug addicts and alcoholics will never be able to safely use drugs and alcohol. However, that's pretty easily taken care of by not putting it in our body. So the second half of step one is what it's all about. It's this: my life has become unmanageable. I'm unable to keep drugs and alcohol in my body. Why? Because I'm not okay without drugs and alcohol in my body. So why am I not okay? And what's going on in my thinking that I have the inability to stop myself from my brain tricking me into picking back up drugs and alcohol? So the first three steps, all theoretical. They're just ideas. Even step three, like I said before, step three is more of a commitment to continue with the rest of the work and actually do something. So 3 and 4 come as a pair in the book. Immediately after turning our will and our lives over to the care of God, we move into a fourth step. You could be at step 3 and say, I turn my will and my life over to God. And then, I see it all the time. People talk about their faith and beliefs, talk a big game. But then when it comes to writing the fourth step, for some reason, they're not working on their fourth step. That's a spiritual theory. I have the idea of God in my head. I don't need to go and do all this work stuff. And then vice versa, I would rather take a guy who says, like, I don't know what I believe, I don't know, but I'm willing to seek, and then is willing to sit down and put in the work. That guy actually has more faith than the other person as far as behavior goes. I mean, as far as actions, the action speaking says the person who says they have faith that's not willing to do the work has no faith, and the person that says they don't have faith or they don't know if they have faith but is willing to do the work is walking in faith. So moving into a fourth step, we want to figure out what's going on with the way the brain is working and figure out how and why this is occurring, this unmanageability, start to address that. There's something powerful about pen and paper. Right now, I cannot see my own face. I need to go look in a mirror, or I would need something to show me my reflection so I can see myself. Same concept. I don't really know what's going on down here in my thinking. So when I sit down and start doing some writing, it reveals to me what's going on in my subconscious and the things that are like driving me and bothering me. And another thing I don't do personally, and any link doesn't do, is a shame-based recovery. Obviously, this has a lot of religious undertone to it with the moral inventory. It absolutely is a moral inventory, and this is a program of altruism. However, the purpose of the fourth step is to identify patterns of thinking and understand what is driving those thought patterns, and then addressing the underlying fears. There's a lot going on underneath with the emotional brain, and there's all kinds of disorders out there. Your typical generalized anxiety, social anxiety, different types of phobias, trauma. All these things are lying underneath and affecting people more than we realize. The first inventory of the fourth step is resentment inventory. The thing about resentment inventory, sometimes it works out perfect because you'll get the alcoholic or drug addict who's resentful at everyone and everything, and that works out great. And then you got people living in a world of delusion or denying their humanity that say, oh yeah, I don't get resentful. And I think 15 years ago that was me, my late teens. I don't get resentful. One of the ways I like to look at resentment is resentiment. Sentiment being some emotion that occurred, some event that happened, something that replays in my head, to happen over and over again, which is something like trauma, which is here's the event that occurred and I'm reliving it over and over again. So that's the way I like to look at resentment is, I have these things that have occurred throughout my life and I'm still experiencing them over and over again. Once again, a lot of people don't understand how much that's still affecting them and driving them. I mean, people, grown adults, some people are affected by their childhood for the rest of their life, and they never get free of some of the stuff that occurred or, overcome some of the difficulties that they've experienced throughout their life. So that is the first thing is sitting down and writing. And so Traditionally, when writing a resentment inventory, I go through all the people, places, and things that make me feel some type of way. That's a modern day saying that they didn't say in the 1930s, but there's just no better way to explain it than feeling some type of way. So I make a list of all that, which I'm going to get more into as far as that goes. I just wanted to give an overview of the first inventory, which is resentment inventory. The next inventory is a fear inventory. Fear is very interesting. It is obviously it's a psychological thing, but then it has physiological effects. These physiological effects and this visceral experience can drive the person. That's why when it says somebody got drunk or high and they didn't even understand how it happened, it's because of this visceral experience that occurs that kind of the physiology takes over. All of a sudden I'm like, oh my God, I don't know how I ended up drunk or high. But the interesting thing about a human being is an imminent threat and a perceived threat are not treated any differently. So that's the thing about like anxiety and phobias and trauma. It's like, if I am experienced a perceived threat, it's still the same fear and same physiological response. So, there's imminent danger, which is why the fear system, exists and it protects us. However, with, human beings, versus all the other animals that they've studied, ours is more complex. Theirs is a little more simple and ours is a lot more complex because we have fears that can be irrational. I don't think rats are wondering how their fur looks today or, if people are talking about them. And then the third inventory of the book is what they call sex conduct inventory. It's 2022, so I just call it conduct inventory because conduct inventory can be done on any relationship. It's a wonderful inventory. It's a very useful inventory. Behavior will tell you more about a person than anything. My conduct in relationships and how I show up in areas says way more about me than what I'll tell you. The third inventory, conduct inventory, a great piece of inventory, but it can be misleading calling it sex inventory because then their thoughts run with it. The way they used to speak about gender roles almost 100 years ago is different than what we're all about today. So going back to it, identifying these different entities and making a list, often referred to as a grudge list. In the second column, I write how I made the list. Why is this something that I have resentment or resentment towards? Why is this something that is sticking with me? How did it affect me? Like, what did it do to me? And then I write what this person, place, or thing did to me and what I think is the reason that it bothered me or that I hold some type of resentment. Then we move into column 3, which is the actual reason why something bothered me. Because somebody can walk into a room, do something, to act out some type of way, and one person doesn't care at all, and another person gets extremely offended. And it's like, that's because of each person's internal condition. Once again, resentiment. A lot of things bring back events of the past or causing certain emotions to arise. How I'm actually affected starts off with like self-esteem. That's the way I see myself, the role I've assigned myself. My self-esteem is who I am in regards to that. Pride would be the next thing, and that would be how I want the world to see me, how I should have been seen in this. People say alcoholics and drug addicts are egomaniacs with low self-esteem. So it's like I have this intense pride of everybody should see me in this high regard, and then my self-esteem is often low, and so I feel like shit about myself, but you should think I'm great. And the next one would be ambition. Anytime I have a resentment, there was something I wanted that didn't happen. That's why I'm resentful. And my self-esteem was affected, my pride was affected, my ambition, which is my wants. Next would be security. There was something that I thought I needed to be okay that I didn't get, and so I think I'm not okay. It's threatening my security, Personal relations, that is how I know how everyone's supposed to show up in their role. So if I have resentment at a teacher, it's like, I know how teachers are supposed to teach and how they're supposed to act. If I'm resentful at the gas station attendant, It's because I know how gas station attendants are supposed to do their jobs. Everywhere I go, I know how everyone else is supposed to do their job. I know how others are supposed to parent. I know how fathers are supposed to parent. I know how siblings are supposed to act. It's wonderful because I'm so good at knowing how they're supposed to show up in their roles, even though here I am, a drug addicted alcoholic, and I can't manage my own life, but I can manage everybody else's. Sex relations, once again, this is more of a gender identity thing. How this impacts my gender role in this aspect, which is probably even more relevant today and can really be expounded upon with today's wider spectrum of gender realization. Finally, pocketbook. Often I'm resentful because somebody has threatened my financial security. It's like, somebody comes in and they destroy something and I got it for free. It's like, oh man, it's okay. But when somebody does something and it hurts something that's more valuable, it's funny that the resentment's going to be greater when somebody damages something that's more expensive. It's like that. Or if somebody gets you fired, or there's so many situations where my finances are affected, and once again, it's like I'm not resentful about what you did. I'm resentful at how it's going to affect me. After those 3 columns are identified, we pause. We look at the first 3 columns where we have just looked at the world and how it affected us, and I pray about it, and I ask to see my part, and that's when the personal accountability comes in. That's where I look at analyzing my actions and behaviors that were selfish in regard to that resentment or something similar. So it could be actions and behaviors selfish to that particular entity, or it can be actions and behaviors like, here I am resentful at this person, but over here I've done this to this other person, but how dare this person do it to me? So sometimes the actions and behaviors that are selfish I've done elsewhere, but now all of a sudden it's done to me. So it's not always selfish actions and behaviors direct. Sometimes it's indirect, what my insanity is. So then behind actions and behaviors, thoughts and attitudes. So every time I behave a certain way or act a certain way, there's an attitude behind that. If I ignore somebody and don't communicate well with them and I guess announce boundaries or, whatever. If I act a certain type of way, there's a thought or attitude behind that of, oh, I'm better than, or they're not worth my time, or, So every time I do something selfish, there's some attitude behind it that says that my behavior is okay. And then the thought or attitude, which justifies these actions and behaviors, is created by delusion. And then behind the delusion is a fear, and that's how, it's like a defense mechanism, coping mechanism. I'm experiencing fears in life, so I create delusions to protect myself. To do a simple rundown, I may be behaving a certain type of way. My thought or attitude is like, life owes me something. I can act in self-pity or a victim mentality because these people got it easier than I do and I have it harder. The delusion behind that is that, somehow other people don't have it hard. All the same possibilities aren't accessible to me, so I live in this delusion where other people have this leg up. And so that would all go back to the fear of being less than, fear of failure, fear of whatever. I have all these fears about life and other people, so I create a delusion in response to that fear. Through that delusion, I have these thoughts or attitudes towards other people, and then I act out in a certain way. So the fear is driving selfishness. And then in the next fear inventory, we look at the fears that we have found through sentiment and all the things in life that have made us feel some type of way. In a regular fear inventory, we just simply write, the different fears that we have in life, write why we have those fears. And then the third column of a fear inventory, a lot of places give a very inadequate explanation, or they don't go in depth enough. I've seen places that have a worksheet that says has self-reliance failed you? And it's a checkbox or a yes or no. And I would say, in the third column, we look at how self-reliance failed me. What does it look like to rely on self? Because once again, we're coming in and there's people who saying they have faith and they believe in God and all this stuff, but when it comes to fears and life difficulties, all of a sudden it's like self-reliance is all over the place. Rely on God when it's easy or convenient, but when I'm threatened or I fear something is going to happen to me or not going to happen for me, I have to take matters into my own hands. Let's just say a person says, I fear school or taking tests or something along those lines. They would state the reason why they have that fear. They don't want to disappoint themselves or others, or it feels uncomfortable to be put in that situation. And then they'll sit down and look at all the reasons, like, why do I have this fear? Which is huge, because fear is often not rational or sensible at all. And so, it's funny. I've had fear about things before, and then when I sat down to write, like, why I even had the fear, I struggled, and I'm like, oh wait, why do I even fear this? Like when you actually try to process it, it's like, I don't even know why I fear this. And so we would look at self may just say, hey, I'm not going to do it. This scares me, and so I'm just not going to do it. Another selfish way to respond would be, you know what, I am going to do it, but I'm going to cheat. I'm going to take matters into my own hands, and I'm just going to do it my way. Or, a big one especially for drug addicts and alcoholics, I'm just going to get a bunch of amphetamines and speed and do whatever, and so it's like, I have all these ways to selfishly address this fear and this problem. And then I move into the fourth column of, what would God have me do? Well, that's where we all have that inner guide, the inner voice, that light inside. And they would tell me that, God would say, hey, how about you put in an ample amount of study time? How about you express, your troubles and concerns to your teacher? How about you get involved in study groups and connect with other people in the class? That is just a small example and a very simplistic one of, here's a fear I have and why I have it. And then here's all the selfish ways that I handle it, which says I don't have any faith at all. I'm not a big fan of the word faith. I'm more of a opposite of fear is love, and love-based decisions would be asking others for help, putting in ample study time, and all these things. So yeah, love isn't this fairy tale, romantic, dreamy thing all the time. Sometimes love looks like sacrifice and discipline and boundaries, and so it's not always appeasing. I want to make peace and make everything okay, because sometimes that's fear. I'm afraid to stand up for myself. I'm afraid to take action, so I'm going to hide it. The most dangerous selfishness is selfishness hidden behind virtue, selfishness hidden behind God. Scarily enough, that happens far too often. Recently told a guy, I said, you've been lied to all your life. And I was like, there's no chosen race of people, that somehow are closer to God than everyone else. It's not God talks to the man and then everyone else obeys, And then furthermore, love is love. Whether you love someone of the same sex or both sexes or whatever, the whole spectrum, it all boils back down to, am I living in defect and hurting people, or am I living in virtue? Because if I'm a kind person that is caring and helpful, and that is love. And those who know love know God, and those that don't know love don't know God. So it's like every being on this planet, every creature is equal parts God, equal access to God. And then finally, conduct inventory, where we look at each relationship, we look at the selfishness involved, dishonesty, all the different forms of dishonesty. There's, straight up lying, and that's the first thing that people will give up or say, like, oh, well, I'm not lying anymore. But then it's like there's still deceitfulness and denial. Deceitfulness, keeping secrets, lying by omission, and denial, just being in a state of delusion, believing my own bullshit, or, not willing to see truth, And then, how I've been inconsiderate in this relationship. I look at who was harmed by my actions in this relationship. And then I look at jealousy, suspicion, bitterness. It's really interesting the way that we do that is, where did I arouse jealousy, suspicion, bitterness in myself? Let me give you an example of that as well. Say you did a conduct inventory on my relationship with God, which is very humbling. I could be jealous of what God does for other people. So here's my relationship with God, and looking at jealousy, it's like, oh, well, I'm jealous of what God's doing for other people. This is bullshit, Suspicion. Oh, I'm suspicious, man. if I do God's will, I might not get what I want. I'm suspicious. Like, here's God's will, that if I do the right thing, or if I do as God would have me, it's not going to work out the way I want to. So. And then ultimately, bitterness is, just like looking at things that have happened to me, or circumstances in my life that, like, look at what God's put me through, and look at my disadvantages, and just that overall bitterness. And so you can imagine in any relationship, you can do conduct inventory on almost anything, and you can imagine the jealousy, suspicion, and bitterness I have in all these different relationships. And then I look at, is this how God would have me show up in all these different relationships? And then I look at how God would have me show up in each individual relationship. And then ultimately look at how we have showed up itself, or as God would not have us, and consider how God would have us show up. And through all that, come up with a sane and sound conduct ideal, how I want to show up, really just across the board on a daily basis, but in all my affairs and all my relationships. So, when the 12th step says practice these principles in all our affairs, it's referring to showing up with the conduct that God would have me in all my affairs. And so that's why there's a significant amount of work that happens between step 3 and step 12. 4 through 11 allow me to help other people and show up well, but simply just making that third step decision and saying a prayer, I'm not immediately just showing up as God would have me. And when we get into the 5th step, one of the lines in the 5th step says we tell someone all of our life story. So we're telling someone all of our life story. Well, we're taking a 4th step, these 3 inventories, into a 5th step. And so through these 3 inventories, I'm actually, pretty much compiling my life story. And then not just my life story as far as like externals, but also my life story as in regards to, the life I've lived in my head, and the way I've perceived things, and telling your blanket life story of events that have occurred on a chronological timeline versus what was going on in my mind. That's it gets interesting, to say the least. And then I take these inventories and I take them to someone else and I process them. I go and I read this to someone, and it's like I'm standing there, I'm sitting there admitting these things that most of which have been kept in my head and inside myself. Now all of a sudden I'm talking about it. So 4th step, I'm putting in the action, and then moving out of that, really putting in the work, showing that I actually have faith, or that I'm willing to do the will of God, and that I actually am willing to take love-based action. It's powerful to then move on and admit these things to another person and in front of God. It's a powerful experience. 4th step, where the work really starts. This is where you put your money where your mouth is. To the extent I work on my 4th step, and the effort and the thoroughness and fearlessness that I put into my 4th step is how much I want to stay sober, how willing I am to do what God would have me. It's a very foolproof system. You can't cheat God. Authentic action gets authentic result. If I don't truly put real love-based action into my 4th step, I'm not going to get a authentic result. You get out what you put into it. So the ultimate truth is action. The only truth is when someone takes the action.